You've made it. Well done. 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning after a grueling weekend. I'm impressed. So as you might have gathered by now, the theme for the weekend is all about different gifts and different roles and understanding and valuing different roles in the church. And what I want to do this morning is think about the subject of valuing differences. And really ask the question, why? You know, I made the point yesterday that, you know, if you look at Paul's letters, he seems to think that this subject of gifts and different roles is important. You know, he talks to different churches and he keeps on mentioning it. And so why? Why does it matter so much to him? Why is it important? Or why does it seem to be important to him? That's my fundamental question. It also strikes me that yesterday we kind of analysed the Bible, but we didn't really read it. We didn't take a bit of text and read it. So we're going to put that right today. You'll be pleased to hear we're going to take a little bit of Romans, because that's always exciting. Now, Romans is an amazing book. It's quite dense. It's quite hard. So what we're going to do is take a little bit, and we're going to take some time to read it carefully and unpack it and see if we can work out what Paul's saying. Because I think in Romans we get a clue, and a really big clue, as to why he thinks this subject of gifts and differences and valuing differences is so important. Okay, so this is from Romans 12, starting at verse 3. 4, and taken from the NIV. 4, by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. That is our text for the morning. Okay, so thinking about valuing differences, I learned at a fairly young age that the world does not value differences. I was born and spent my early years in leafy Surrey, near Hazelmere. But then when I was quite young, we moved to Sheffield. And I went to a junior school in Sheffield. And I learned very early that you don't want to be different, you want to be the same. And all my new classmates had an accent. You know, they talked about grass and castle. And I talked about grass and castle. And I very quickly learned, you do not want to stand out. You do not want to be different. The world does not value differences. The world values people who are the same. But not just we want everyone to be the same, we want everyone to be like me. You know, it's not just everyone needs to be the same standard. I determine what that standard is. I was thinking about, and I'm just as guilty, I was thinking about driving the other day. Now, I'm a pretty good driver. And because I'm a pretty good driver, I drive at the correct speed. And what I noticed was my attitude to people who drive at a different speed. So if I'm driving along at the internationally agreed correct speed, and I come up behind someone who's going slower, what do I think of them? What an idiot. Why are they driving so slowly? Why don't they learn how to drive? What's wrong with you? But if I'm driving along at the correct speed, and I get overtaken by someone, what's my attitude to them? they're a maniac. Why are they in such a hurry? Have they got a death wish? Do they want to kill us all? What's wrong with them? Because how do we know what the right speed is? Well, it's the speed that I drive, because I set the standard. And if you're different, you're wrong. Would you agree that seems to be human? This is not just about Christians and churches. This is about being human. We struggle to accept that different people have different approaches to things, different thoughts, different ideas, different opinions. We want everyone to be like us. But Paul is having none of it. So he says, for just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. So obviously, because Paul says this in several places, and because we Christians all read the Bible, the church stands out from the world, doesn't it? By valuing differences, by allowing everyone to pursue their own particular gift and valuing all those gifts differently. We do, don't we, in church? That's what churches are like, isn't it? So I became a Christian when I was 16, and my first kind of church environment was what you would probably call conservative evangelical. And we all knew that the most important thing was personal evangelism, was sharing your faith. That was the priority for everyone, okay? Because it was easy and it was powerful. If only everyone would do it, that's the thing that's going to change the world. And so I'd go to parties with a couple of my Christian friends, and it was excruciating. Because it would happen every time. We'd be in the middle of the party, everyone was having a nice time, having chats, and then one of my friends would start sharing the gospel. And they'd raise their voice in order to do it. It was impossible to avoid. And the atmosphere in the room would change. Suddenly, it was desperately uncomfortable. And I was praying for them to stop. But God didn't listen to my prayer. They plowed on. And it was like they were just unaware of how uncomfortable it was. It's like they're completely insensitive to the atmosphere. And then the worst thing would happen, which is the person they were talking to would be interested. And it would make them think. And then a couple of weeks later, you discover that person had become a Christian. And it just proved I was wrong. I was a bad Christian. Because I couldn't do it. And then when I was kind of halfway through my student years, I fell among bad types. And I went to a different church, where obviously the priority was not personal evangelism. The priority was signs and wonders. And so we'd go and we'd stand on do you know does anyone know Manchester? The Arndale Centre in Manchester. The biggest shopping centre in Manchester. So on a Saturday afternoon, it would be thronged with, shoppers. And we would kind of stand there on the streets and pray for people to be healed loudly, and it was excruciating. I'd try and stand at the back, and I really hoped that none of my fellow students, people who knew me, would see me there. And sometimes God acted, that was the thing. Sometimes someone got healed, and it just proved that I was a bad Christian. And then a few years later, I went to a church where everyone understood. Everyone knew that the most important thing was social justice, was changing the world, because that is obviously what all Christians are called to give their lives to. And all the talk just made me feel tired. How on earth are we going to change the world? I can't change myself, let alone the world. And the confidence You know, we're going to change the world. Really? Or us? You know, have you seen how many of us there are? I mean, have you seen how big the world is? And does the world want to be changed? You know, if we ask them, it seems a bit pushy. You know, if anyone else, any other political group, religious group, whatever, says we're going to change the world, my instant reaction is, no, you're not. You're not going to change me. So, you know, what gives us the right to steam in and change the world? This is what's going on in my head, but I can't say any of it. Because as soon as I ask any of these kind of questions, it becomes obvious from everyone's reaction that I'm just a bad Christian. No, it's obvious that this is the most important thing. And the thing is, I'm the same. You know, people sometimes come up to me and they say, oh, Bill, you're such an amazing teacher. You've got such a powerful gift. And particularly having come back to Hope, because there are a few people at Hope who I knew 30 years ago, you know, when it was a youth group. And they said, oh, Bill, I still remember a talk you did 35 years ago and it changed my life. And I say, oh, that's very kind, thank you very much. But I'm thinking, well, pull yourselves together. I mean, it's not hard. You know, all I do is stand there and point out the bleeding obvious. You know, why can't you read the Bible for yourself? It's not seriously, it's not difficult. It's pretty clear. You know, just try a bit harder. Why do I have to do all this spoon feeding? You know, what's wrong with you? Why are you such bad Christians? Do I really think that? Well, here's the thing. The thing is, I'm passionate, maybe because I felt such a misfit in so many churches. I really believe in differences. You know, I really, really believe this stuff about different gifts and valuing difference. So in my head, I know that we're all different, okay? And if I've got one gift, well, others got other gifts. And I've got pretty big weaknesses. But that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like. Come on. You know, this is so easy and so obvious. And I think that's the trouble. You know, why are Christians like this? Well, I think it's two things. We start with that basic human thing that everyone shares of, you know, I want everyone to be like me. But then you add in a spiritual gift, and this thing that I think we should all be doing, it seems like God agrees. Because when I do it, you know, it seems to have a powerful effect, which is out of proportion to what I'm doing. So God's on my side. God agrees with me. You know, when I say, you know, if everyone did a theology degree, that's the thing that would change the world. And God agrees, because that's what I've experienced in my life. That's what it feels like. So I'm just going to turn the page if I've forgotten where I am. And so that this thing that churches should stand out from the world because they value differences. They see different roles as equally valuable and equally important. And what I just notice is we just accept, we just assume that it's normal that different churches have different flavours. And you need to choose a church which suits your flavour. You know, when you move to a new town or a new city and you're looking for a church, and so you talk to someone who knows the town or the city well, and you say, you know, how does the conversation go? Well, they say, well, what are you looking for? Well, what's important to me is worship. Worship. Then you need to go to this church, because they're really good at worship. That's the worship church. No, what I'm really interested in is, you know, whatever it's Bible. Oh, well, you know, Christ Church Clifton. That's where you get good Bible teaching. What I'm looking for, because this is what's important to me, is kind of really slick, professional consumer Christianity. Hope Chapel, Hotwell. Can't go wrong there. Bizarrely, I ended up leading a Vineyard church. And everyone knows that Vineyard churches are all about church planting and signs and wonders. And the number of times I had conversations with people saying, well, you're a teacher. You know, you're passionate about the Bible. What on earth are you doing? How did you end up leading a Vineyard church? You know, because Vineyard pastors aren't Bible people. And the people who are saying this to me were normally Vineyard pastors. Or my own church members. You know, half of them were saying, why are you here? What are you doing? You know, we just assume that different churches have different flavours. You know, where we all pursue this one thing or that one thing. But it clashes with how Paul sees church and how Paul seems to view church as important. You know, together, as a local community, you make up a body and you each have a different role. You're each just a part, you belong to one another, and all those parts are equally valuable, but focus on on your contribution. That's what he says in this passage. And he doesn't just say it in this passage, he says it in 1 Corinthians. What does Paul say again? Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function. So in Christ, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. So why is it so important to Paul? We're now going to do the Bible bit. What I want to show you is something that I noticed for the first time this week. And it was a bit of a light bulb moment. And it's about putting this passage into context and following Paul's argument in Romans from the start and seeing why he's saying this at this particular time. A lot of people say Romans is Paul's greatest letter, and I tend to agree. You know, Romans is Paul's great exposition of the gospel. He presents the gospel in a fuller way, I think. He kind of expands on it in a fuller way than he does anywhere else. It's really important stuff. But in principle, it works like most of Paul's letters work. Most of Paul's letters have two parts. And the first part is what God has done. What God has done for us in Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And then the second part is how do we respond to what God has done. That's the basic structure of most of Paul's letters. Romans is a bit more complicated. Romans starts with the problem. And the second half of Romans 1 is the human condition, or how we went wrong. And it's this great decline. You know, and it starts going wrong when humans decide to stop worshipping God. Stop treating God as God and start worshipping other things. And then their minds become darkened. Their minds become confused. And God hands them over to their confused minds and everything else that's wrong with the world. That in human relationships, everything else goes wrong from that point. But it starts with refusing to worship God. And then basically chapters 3 to chapter 8, chapters 3 to 8 are what God is doing. God's solution to the problem, in both Jesus and the Spirit. And so it's salvation by grace through faith. It's life through Jesus. How in Jesus we overcome the power of death. And then it's about life through the Spirit. And how life through the Spirit is far more effective. It has the power to make us righteous people in a way that the law never does. That's basically the sweep of his argument in chapters 3 to 8. Chapters 9 to 11, he takes a bit of a tangent, because the actual issue in Rome is about Jews and Gentiles, and they're not getting on very well. And so he applies everything he's just said about what God has done, he applies it to Jews and Gentiles. But then he turns the page, And at the beginning of chapter 12, he moves on to how do we respond to everything that God has done in chapters 3 to 8. Everything that God has done through Jesus and the Spirit, what is our response? And that starts at the beginning of chapter 12, okay? It's the start of the second big part of the book of Romans, following the typical Pauline pattern. Are you with me so far? So how does Romans 12 start? This is so familiar. You will know this. Therefore, listen, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. So in view of everything that God has done for us, everything I've just covered in chapters 3 to 8, although Paul didn't think in terms of chapters 3 to 8, it was just a letter. But given everything I've explained, all the mercy that God has poured out to us through Jesus and the Spirit, in view of all of that, this is what you need to do. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. Great, really familiar 2 verses, would you agree? What does it mean? It's a summary. It's a summary statement. It's a very broad, general statement. Be transformed. The way that you need to respond to this is to be transformed, and the way you'll be transformed is by renewing your mind. It's a summary statement. But it raises more questions than it answers. Well, how are we changing our mind? What thinking are we going to stop? What thinking are we going to start? And how is that new thinking going to transform us? You know, I want to know more, Paul. Please, would you unpack this for us? And that's exactly what he does. So the next few verses, in fact, the next couple of chapters, he unpacks these 2 verses, I would strongly suggest. He unpacks, he explains what he means by be transformed by the renewing of your mind. How do I know that? Well, let's look at verse 3. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. Notice the first word, for. Okay? So he's explaining, he's unpacking what he's just said. Okay? He's moving on to explain and unpack. He's saying because. He's explaining it in more detail. But above all, what we miss in the English is there's wordplay in this verse. In the Greek, there's an unavoidable wordplay, and we miss it in English. Because he says, or the NIV has, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with sober judgment. The NRSV is much more of a word-for-word translation. It follows the Greek more closely. So this is how the NRSV translates this verse. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment. Okay, now what words do you think he's focusing on? Any ideas? Think, act, absolutely. And in the Greek, phronein, to think. Except the NRSV doesn't capture it fully, because the NRSV has sober judgment. In the Greek, it's sophronein. It's wise thinking. So in fact, 4 times in the same phrase, he uses phronein. Okay? And what he's doing is he's drawing attention to something. He's grabbing our attention. And what he's announcing is, we're going to look at this thinking thing. Why is that? Because what he's unpacking is, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He's saying you need to think differently. So in verse 3, he's saying, okay, so what we're going to look at in more detail is this think. What are we talking about when we're saying think differently? And you get a hint of what he's thinking about, because he says, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. What he's talking about is humility, pride and humility, and how we see ourselves, how we place ourselves. Sorry, turn the page again. And now we get to our passage. Okay? Notice again the first word, for. So now he's moving to the next level. We know he's going to examine this subject of thinking, but now he's going to tell us what kind of thinking he's looking for, and the kind of thinking which is going to transform us. And this kind of thinking, which is a kind of humble thinking rather than a proud thinking. And what does that thinking look like? Well, the way we need to think, the way we need to see ourselves, the way we need to understand ourselves as a body is that we are individually parts of the body, that we belong to one another, that together we represent the whole, which is Jesus, but that we have different roles within them. And all of those different roles, we should be pursuing those, but they're all equally valuable. And when we pursue those and value them and encourage others to value theirs and work together, then we will represent Jesus as fully as we can. And that's what we're called to do. If we think that way, then we will live out. We will live that out. And we will no longer conform to the pattern of this world. Because the world doesn't operate like that. The world says we all need to be the same, and you need to be like me. This is an utterly different way of being. Valuing differences. Valuing one another's differences and encouraging one another to pursue them. Let me just repeat that, because I think it's quite significant. The book of Romans, I would say, is Paul's greatest letter. He fully outlines, he unpacks the gospel in a more expansive way than he does anywhere else. And then in chapter 12, he says, how should you respond to the gospel? What does responding to the gospel look like? Well, the responding to the gospel looks like thinking this way about yourselves and about others in your community and living it out. Really? This is how I read it. If I've got it wrong, change my mind. But it would explain why Paul seems to see this as important. And if we think about how important, how seriously churches tend to take it, I think we've got a problem, I would suggest. But it kind of still leaves a question. You know, I still want to know why. Because this, I don't know about you, but I've never had this explained to me before in this way. It's never been pointed out that this is what Paul is arguing here. So it feels new. I feel slightly uncomfortable because, you know, I can't say, well, I've got this from Gordon Fee and Richard Hayes and, you know, it's something that occurred to me in the last couple of weeks as I was reading this and asking myself the question, why is this so important to Paul? This subject of gifts and differences and valuing differences. And it's nice to hear them having a lovely time. Although there is a limit. And so I reflected, I tried to ask myself, why might that be? Why does Paul seem to be suggesting that the response to the gospel that he's looking for is this mindset about one another, about valuing differences? Why could it possibly be? And I think it's back to the picture of Romans as a whole. Think about Romans 1. What is the human problem? The human problem is pride. And it starts with not allowing God to be God, but putting ourselves in God's seat. Now, one way of explaining pride and thinking about pride is, you know, last night we sang, Jesus Jesus be the centre of it all? Jesus be the centre of it all. I think that's how it goes. Pride is elbowing Jesus aside and saying, no, you're not the centre of it all. I'm the centre of it all. So what I think the priorities are, they should be everyone's priorities. Because it's my judgment about that counts. It's my understanding of the world, the way I see things, my perception, that's reality, that's truth. It's my judgment about what's right and wrong, and good and bad. Well, that's what's right and wrong and good and bad, and others should accept that that's the way it is. Because I'm the centre of it. I'm the one who decides these things, okay? Because I'm in that seat. I'm the chief exec. And the process of becoming humble is to step out of that seat and say, no, actually, Jesus, you are the centre of it all. Because your will, what does Paul say? Your will is good, pleasing, and perfect. My will is imperfect. So I may want things to be a certain way, but I'm going to go with what you want. Your knowledge is complete, whereas mine is just partial. I see some things, but I don't see all of them. So if what you say is true, what you say is real, well, that's what I'm going to believe. No, your judgment is sound. Mine is fallible. So if you say something's right, if you say something's wrong, then I'm going to accept that. That's going to be my standard too. And so Jesus is in the centre. Jesus is kind of saying, this is the way things are. And I'm in orbit around him. I've got a bit of the picture, but for me it's partial. I'm a part of the whole. I offer some things, but he's the whole. He's completeness. He's perfection. That's what humility looks like. And the thing is, if I'm in the centre, then I need to be surrounded by people who are like me. Because that reinforces the fact that I'm right about this stuff. That doesn't threaten my position, determining what's right, what's good, the way things should be, what the priorities are, what we should be focusing on. I can be quite comfortable sitting in the centre when I'm surrounded by people who are like me. As soon as people come along who have a different view, who have a different part of the whole, have a different understanding, it raises all these questions. It basically says to me, should you be sitting there? Is that your seat? Why are you there? And that undermines my pride. Whereas if I'm in orbit, if I'm just part of the whole, there's plenty of room for others. There's room for others to bring their contribution. And I just wonder whether for Paul, this is the indicator. This is the indicator of, are we proud or are we humble? It's a great sign. It's significant to him. It betrays the way we see the world and whether we see ourselves at the centre or not. The other thing that occurs to me is this is the exact reverse of Romans 1. Remember Romans 1? Where did we go wrong? We didn't allow God to be God, and we took his place. We elbowed him aside and took his place. And then what happened? Our thinking went wrong. Our thinking became confused. And so we were handed over to that thinking, and everything else went wrong. What's he saying here? Reverse that process. Reverse that process. Change your thinking back again. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And what that means is stepping out of the centre and letting him have the big chair. It's the exact reversal of Romans 1. So, very quickly, how? How do we do this? Well, I mean, Paul says it is about thinking. It's recognizing this is important. And I just think we don't talk. What I love is that we spent the whole weekend looking at this subject. And I think it's really important that we look at this subject. And it's really important we don't just, look at it as a nice weekend. We think about, well, how are we actually going to live this out? How are we going to no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world? How are we going to stand out? How are we going to be transformed? What does it look like to be a hope chapel that values differences? And because we're so used to valuing similarities rather than differences, it might be uncomfortable. The thing about being surrounded by people who are the same is it's a comfortable place. Stepping out of that, in fact, I think will involve some discomfort. But the challenge is to be as comfortable with differences as we are with similarities. I think once we arrive at that place, that's a sign we're getting there. But it's a bit like when you're trying to defeat the power of money in your life. Yeah, you're trying to think differently and stop loving money. Often the best way is to actually do something that breaks that power, that helps that change in the mind. And I think there are a couple of things that have occurred to me that are the same. You break the power of money in your life by being generous, by actually choosing to give someone something. That's how you change your thinking in your head. Same with it. I've come up with a couple of ideas. Try this for size. Yesterday we did an exercise when we looked at differences, and we sat in groups of people who were the same. Who is the person in our community who's most different from you? Who's most different from you? It often is your husband or your wife. But how can you encourage, value, and bless that person in being themselves? What can we do with this person who you have nothing in common with? What can you do to celebrate them, to champion them? How can you pray for them? Can you publicly praise them? Can you draw attention to something they've done which is really good? Can you thank them? What can we do to celebrate someone who's the most different? Because I tend to recognize and value and appreciate and praise those who do something which I rate because it's like me. How can we go to the other extreme? Another one, the last one is thinking about how do we use our gifts? How do we use our gifts? And who are we serving most when we use our gifts? So for me, because I love the Bible, the temptation is to teach and to speak towards and to have in mind when I'm preaching people who are like me, and speak to, because they're the people I want to impress. They're the people I want to please. And so I might try and come up with the most impressive, most sophisticated, most kind of thoroughly thought through, I want to display my biblical knowledge. I want to use words that no one understands. They understand, but no one else understands. But if I find this stuff easy, then actually the people who I can serve most are the people who find it hard. And so my aim when I preach is to say, this is someone who finds the Bible difficult, confusing, irrelevant, and boring. So how can I use all of my skills and learning and effort to make it as interesting as possible, as easy as possible to understand, as relevant as possible? Because when I pour out my gift for them, then I'm really using it, I think, in the maximum way. Then I'm serving them rather than trying to impress my friends. Who are our gifts for? We tend to think our gifts are for us. We get the privilege of using them, but I think they're actually for the people who are nothing like us. And that's another mindset change. There's one final thing I wanted to say, which is I think it's ironic that we, Hope Chapel, are looking at this. Because of all the churches that I've ever been to, ever been part of, ever led, or led in, I think we probably needed this. Because I think we're already not bad at this stuff. I think there's a couple of reasons. I think the original design thing, the fact that we do that so much, is quite a useful tool to get us to understand to see people as unique and valuable. It kind of puts us in that mindset of, how can we help this person discover their uniqueness and value it and appreciate it? And I think that's really good. I also think that it's about leadership style. I think, and also the culture that the leaders have created, which is very encouraging and very releasing. It's not at all controlling. It's about how can we help you be who you are and do what you're called to. So I think what I don't want to give the impression is we're useless and we're starting from ground zero. I think we're already on the way, but I think it's such a powerful thing if we can really lean into it. Now I know it's new to me, this stuff. I don't know how convincing you find it. For me, it was a kind of light bulb moment, in the last couple of weeks when it occurred to me. If you want to talk about it further, if you want to change my mind, please do. Amen.
Thanks, Bill.
That's right.
Yeah, that's pretty good.